All right. All right. We are back live from City Hall, live from Occupied City Hall. This is the Rockford reading segment. We're going to go ahead and finish up this chapter from In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. I know that this reading may not be militant enough for some people, but for the people who think that everything else we do is too militant or too extreme, the hopes is this can be something that's a little bit more moderate that they can participate in and follow along in. My fault, I'm just trying to make sure everything good with the audio. If there's any problems with the audio, just give a shout out in the comments. Okay. Oh, again, and I like to do this at the beginning of these every time. This is Rockford Reading, which is a segment in which a member of the May 30th Alliance reads through a piece of literature and while reading through the literature, speaks about how the concepts brought up in the literature correlate to issues that we're facing in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County, or how the ideology or the tactics can be related to what it is that we're facing and dealing with currently. And so I'm not going to go into a big introduction since this is the second one of the day. I'm just going to pick up where we left off at and continue. Please share this. If you're watching this, please share this too. I should be sharing it, but I'm gonna share it in a second. I'll share it in a second. Okay, sorry about that, sorry. All right, we're in the middle of page 59. Again, this is In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. We're on chapter 2, Looting Emancipation, the bottom of page 59. When the slave states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas seceded from the United States and formed their own federal government, the Confederacy, in the winter of 1860, they did so under the banner of states' rights with the aim of protecting and expanding slavery. They hoped that their secession would be recognized by the North and that they would be allowed to split away. The Confederate leadership's reasoning wasn't totally wrong-headed. They anticipated that Lincoln and the North quite possibly might accept a peaceful secession, and, in case of war, they felt confident in the gallantry of Southern gentlemen and the support of the French and English Empire, an empire whose global domination was built in substantial part on profits and textiles made from plantation cotton. Much as the North, they foresaw any martial conflict being short-lived and relatively bloodless. Even when war broke out, they had no immediate reason to fear the coming end of their system. This is one of the most important interventions Du Bois' Black Reconstruction makes. To clearly lay out that the... I couldn't tell if somebody honking for me or not. Or for us or not. I don't know. I can't tell what that honk. It's a honk, but I can't tell what kind of honk it is. Sometimes it's friendly honks, sometimes it's unfriendly honks. Honks that come along with epithets. Okay, let's continue. This is one of the most important interventions Du Bois' Black Reconstruction makes. To clearly lay out that the Union did not intend to free the slaves and that emancipation was against the Union's economic, political, and social interests. The abolitionists of the time knew this well. As Frederick Douglass famously put it in a speech in 1865, the war was begun, quote, in the interest of slavery on both sides. The South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North fighting to keep it in the Union. The South fighting to get it beyond the limits of the United States Constitution, and the North fighting for the old guarantees, both despising the Negro, both insulting the Negro. And so I think that out of all the things that we've read in this, it's been a lot of very important things that have been mentioned in this chapter, that have been mentioned throughout the book. But I think one of the things that sums up the dirty secret of the Civil War, the dirty secret of the altering of slavery, the dirty secret of this country, it is that Abraham Lincoln, the man that is celebrated as freeing the slaves. The Union, the North, the place that is celebrated as these, the original white hero complex or white savior complex is the story of the Union Army, putting down the Confederates to end slavery and all over the country. But the truth of the fact is, this quotation This quotation right here by Frederick Douglass that says, "In the interest of slavery on both sides, the South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North fighting to keep it in the Union. The South fighting to get it beyond the limits of the United States Constitution, and the North fighting for the old guarantees, both despising the Negro, both insulting the Negro." And when you look at the Civil War in that aspect, when you look at that time period in that aspect, it answers so many of the questions as to why once no longer in physical bondage, black people cannot fully grow in this nation and fully grow in this country and fully grow in this society. And it is because at every step in which since the moment that Africans were brought into this country, there has not been a step in which, damn, that is crazy. This honking is crazy. I don't know. It's hilarious. I just don't know where it's coming from. It's just somebody honking. It'd be funny if somebody was watching this and doing a honking to purposely distract me. It would be, you succeeded. If that's what you're doing, you succeeded. Is the internet working fine? Yeah, I feel like the internet working fine. But again, this chapter has been specifically on the Civil War, the area around the time of the Civil War, mainly before the Civil War, honestly. Mainly it's been speaking about the ingredients that led up to the Civil War, the social atmosphere that led up to the Civil War taking place. And to me, again, this paragraph here sort of embodies all this information that we've been getting. The Union did not intend... The Union did not intend to free the slaves, and that emancipation was against the Union's economic, political, and social interest. The abolitionists of the time knew this well. As Frederick Douglass famously put it in a speech in 1865, the war was begun, quote, "in the interest of slavery on both sides. The South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North fighting to keep it in the Union. The South fighting to get it beyond the limits of the United States Constitution, and the North fighting for the old guarantees, both despising the Negro, both insulting the Negro." As Du Bois argues, not only could the North never have fielded an army under the slogan, quote, "abolition of the slaves," end quote, it did not want to. Nor did free soil, the political argument unifying the Republican Party, make any sense in justifying a war with the South where there was, after all, no new, quote, "free soil," end quote, to settle. Quote, on the other hand, the tremendous economic ideal of keeping this great market for goods, the United States, together with all its possibilities of agriculture, manufacture, trade, and profit, appealed to both the West and the North. And what was then much more significant, it appealed to the border states. End quote. They have in the midst of reading this book, there are asterisks at certain parts, and the author elaborates deeper on those asterisks. Damn, this playing low than a motherfucker. Damn, this playing low as hell. I don't know how people. All right. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. I want to read this excerpt because it's a bigger portion than usual. So this is what the excerpt next to the asterisk has at the bottom of the page. This is one of the many ways that the Confederacy underestimated the power of the people. When England did not immediately support the Southern cause, the planters organized a boycott against selling cotton to England, which was then made moot by a Union blockade of the Southern coast. Though many planters continued selling their cotton on the black market to the North, England, and Europe, as well as capitalists. What's up? What up? What up? This horn, that shit crazy. Okay. The textile factory owners in northwest England cut back dramatically on textile production, sending thousands of English workers into unemployment, an event referred to as the Lancashire cotton famine. But rather than give in to this blackmail on the part of both of their bosses and the slaveocracy, in one of history's great moments of international solidarity, the working people of Northern England organized mutual aid to see themselves through the crisis, including a series of riots that had them looting bread, held protests demanding their employers and the English government remain steadfast against the Confederacy and slavery at any cost, and sent declarations in support of emancipation to Lincoln. This unrest helped keep the English out of the war until the Emancipation Proclamation, at which point England's entry on the side of the Confederacy became politically impossible. And that's just a little history lesson that was there. Well, I guess that's a history lesson within the history lesson. Okay, let's continue. Lincoln, despite whatever tale liberal historians or Hollywood hagiographer. What is a hagiographer? Okay, I gotta look this word up. It's what the laptop for. All right, somebody had just asked me, oh, you got the laptop out here? Yep, this is what the laptop for. We gotta look up that word. We cannot continue reading through. We can't read through these sentences, read through this and not be knowing the words. I gotta know what this word means. Somebody probably watching this and yelling at the phone because they know what it is. I'm sorry. Your vocabulary is more diverse than mine. Okay, hagiography. The writing of the lives of saints. Writing of the lives of saints. What's the context even? That's funny. That's sarcasm. I like the sarcasm that Vicky has in this book. Very subtle sarcasm. Let's continue. Lincoln, despite whatever tale liberal historians or Hollywood hagiographers want to tell, was no abolitionist. Had the war not broken out and had his most ambitious antebellum emancipation proposal going into effect, he would have set slavery in America on a course to legally end in 100 years. In 1958, furthermore, Lincoln believed that the best course of abolition would be to, quote, convince, end quote, black people to immigrate from the United States, a historical position called, quote, colonization. I don't know why I'm reading the word. I ain't gonna make no excuses why I didn't pronounce it right. Colonization, end quote. The same day that Lincoln finished drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, December 31st, 1862, he also signed a contract funding the relocation of 5,000 black men, women, and children to Haiti as an experimental test case for total colonization. The experiment failed miserably, but he was still arguing for colonization as late as 1864. And even in 1865, with emancipation all but completed, Lincoln opposed giving black men the vote. Okay, and this is what we have to remember when these are the things that have to be remembered when you are sending black children to a school named Lincoln, when you are sending white children to a school named Lincoln, when you are sending any children of color to a school named Lincoln, that these are the ideologies that this man held. We cannot live up to the ideals or the aspirations that people who had part in the formation of this country had by ignoring the flaws that those people's ideologies and those people's belief systems had. We do a disservice to humanity when we ignore those things. We do a disservice to the progression of the society when we ignore those things. And so, as a whole, mankind was more barbaric 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And so we don't have to have schools named after presidents from 1860. We don't have to glorify the men that existed in 1860 because of positions that they held, when we know what the ideological positions they held were. So just read just this one paragraph of information should make it so that no city or county or state will want to have a school that they send black children to that is named after someone that held these ideologies. But yet and still they have a middle school here named Lincoln. I went. All right, let's continue. And it's not the fault of the people going to the school or the parents. There's none of these people's fault. It's the fault of the city for even having in 2021 not having changed that or not having addressed that. But the Civil War was the rare historical period, a revolutionary period, in which the desires and goals of the powerful are swept aside utterly by the vision and action of the masses. Just as through their self-emancipation the enslaved gave the Civil War its meaning, so it was their belief that Lincoln would be the great emancipator that would make him appear so to history. Let me read through that again. Sorry, the wind blew the page. Just as through their self-emancipation the enslaved gave the Civil War its meaning, so it was their belief that Lincoln would be the great emancipator that would make him appear so to history. Lincoln's transformation was, ironically, aided by the most rabid Southern ideologues. In both the 1860 presidential contest and in the state-by-state campaigns for secession in the winter of 1860 through 1861, the slavocracy's propagandists painted Lincoln a dangerous enemy of the peculiar institution. Though this was a provocation that Lincoln would continuously deny, it had unexpected consequences. The political campaign Southern nationalists waged to confer legitimacy on peaceful secession, held in the big houses of the plantations and the central squares of Southern cities, was based on the false claim that Lincoln's election would mean abolition, and the campaign couldn't be waged without revealing this logic to the enslaved. So when secession instead came with war and chaos, not an orderly and peaceful legal split, the enslaved did not see some grim tale of, quote, brother fighting brother, end quote, but rather Jubilee, the Bible-ordained day of emancipation, and they fled the plantation in their hundreds of thousands. But they didn't all go at once. As Du Bois argues, a mass movement among a largely illiterate, geographically dispersed and isolated population like that of the 4 million Africans enslaved in the United States builds slowly and in fits and starts. And it was unclear at the outset whether the Union Army was indeed an army of emancipation. In 1861, as Union generals advanced into South Carolina and Virginia, they made assurances to the local owners that slavery would not be threatened. Union General Ambrose Burnside returned fugitives to their plantations, and many generals allowed civilian enslavers to enter their lines and retrieve their, quote, property, end quote. Throughout the first years of the war, the administration refused black volunteers, and Lincoln was deliberating with his cabinet whether or not to attempt an army-wide return of all fugitives. Even through 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army was returning fugitives in the border states to their enslavers. The proclamation had not freed border state slaves anyway. 4 slave states, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, never declared secession and thus remained part of the Union, although allegiances within the states were split and some white men from there fought with the Confederacy. These are known as the border states, and as a result of their presence, the Union always contained slavery within it. So again, that's another thing is to be remembered when we have honest dialogues about this nation, honest dialogues about the history of the nation, the history of this country, and when we truly come to understand why racism is so deeply ingrained and it's something that is almost second nature growing up in this society. It's because of the way in which these things have never left, and how as time has passed there has been a whitewashing of the truth. There's been a falsifying of the truth to fit this narrative of Americanism. No one ever talks about Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, and I shouldn't say no one. I shouldn't do that. There are places where political awareness and political education is more prominent, so that's wrong to do. Obviously, it's being talked about in this book, so it's talked about. However, as we had a young person on yesterday as we were beginning to read this chapter 2, and they spoke about not having ever heard some of the things that were being talked about in this time period, and talked about not hearing about Frederick Douglass or hearing about Nat Turner or hearing about what happened in Haiti yet in school. And so that's a disservice being done to the black youth. That's a miseducation being given to the black youth. It's this only painting painting a half truth of this country. It's arming them with half truths when they encounter society and when they start encountering hindrances and roadblocks. And so, again, it's important to point out that the Union had slaves. The Confederacy had slaves. The Union was not absolved of slavery. They had 4 states that were there that all still continue slavery on. The Union, for the first year when they had slaves or caught fugitives or people who had run away from plantations, they returned them to the people who were enslaving them. And so this wasn't an army of emancipation. This was not an army that you ran to, and once you seen the Union Army, you were now free. You were now out of physical bondage. No, they were returning these people. And so again, throughout the course of history, and this has been a regular thing that we have pointed out in this specific chapter, but the idea that Africans in this country, black people in this country, people of color of this country have had to pick the lesser of two evils, have had to pick their poisons. And so it was to pick the poison of staying in the South in slavery, or trying to run to the Union or run to the North, but then still having to worry about being, if the Union, but still having to worry that if the Union caught you, you could still end up being returned to slavery. And I'm sure if they were returning black people to slavery, they still were participating in lynchings and rapes and and assaults and all types of other inhumane things. We got the battery here. Just said it's on 20%. I want to get through this chapter. Okay, let's run through it. I'm doing a little more reading, a little less talking. My fault. Probably about the first years. Okay, but the enslaved kept striking. Fugitives arrived in the tens, in the hundreds, some fully fit, many in terrible physical condition. What was to be done? General Benjamin Butler hit upon a happy solution in Fort Monroe in Virginia. When asked by enslavers to return 3 men who had escaped to the fort, he refused, declaring the fugitives, quote, contraband of war, end quote, and putting them to work. As the war turned more serious, and as the Union Army desperately needed labor, the soundness of this strategy was recognized, and it was taken up for the year and a half of combat preceding the Emancipation Proclamation. The fact that the Union Army at first would only accept emancipation on terms that continued to regard fugitives as property, contraband or not, reveals just how little this war began as one of emancipation. David Rogers puts it more optimistically, quote, the policy preserved the norms of slave property even as it opened new possibilities to resist bondage, end quote. However, as soon as it became clear that the Union Army would accept fugitives, quote, the movement became a general strike against the slave system on the part of all who would find opportunity. The trickling streams of fugitives swelled to a flood, end quote. In many places, fugitives did the crucial labor in the construction of Union Army infrastructure. Elsewhere, they did equally important agricultural work, gathering the crops on abandoned plantations behind Union lines for the Army to sell. Elsewhere, many more refused to work for the Union as a condition of their liberty, instead squatting and claiming land, setting up agricultural communes, or joining maroon communities. Through their flight and strike, they dramatically transformed conditions on both sides of the front lines. The next logical step, literally unthinkable to both sides only a few years previously, was to arm the fugitives and hire them to serve in the Union Army, a measure that followed quickly on the heels of the Emancipation Proclamation. Virulent racism in the Union meant black people were seen as unfit for service, but the Union was facing an enlistment crisis. By 1863, 2 years into the combat, both sides, despite instituting a draft, confronted considerable problems recruiting soldiers. In the North, the poor, largely immigrant populations that represented the majority of Union conscripts resented serving in a bloody and seemingly intraceable war fought on behalf of industrialists. Fought on behalf of industrialists. But this class resentment merged with the resurgent northern anti-blackness and black people, rather than the slavocracy, were blamed for the conflict. And again, that's pointing out that they instead of blaming the slaveholders, instead of blaming the institution of racism that was being built up for the fact that this war was happening, they began to blame black people, which is what happens every time. That's what black people have always been. In this nation, black people have always been a political scapegoat. If things are going bad, find a way to put it on black people. That's how Trump just got elected. Well, he expanded it to all people of color. All right, let's keep pushing. By 1863, okay, I was right there. Okay, the New York City draft riots, among the most violent riots in American history, began as working class, predominantly Irish men rose up against the draft's incredible class bias. The law allowed a man of draft age to hire a substitute for $300, more than $6,000 in 2020 dollars. Damn. Rather than serve, and as a result, few rich men wore the Union blue. But the riots turned into an anti-black pogrom, killing over 100 black people and burning down abolitionist homes, black bars, and the altars, and even black bars and theaters, and even the colored orphan asylum. In the aftermath of the riots, almost the entire black population fled the city, many of them settling in Brooklyn. Though they never reached such violent extremes elsewhere, in 1863, anti-war riots spread and racist anti-war sentiment ran rampant in the North. And I just want to read through this again because this is a pattern that has taken place in the history of America on a regular basis, where some type of social issue is going on, and there's angst in the white community, there's angst in America, and then in the midst of it being angst in the white community, in the midst of it being angst in America, some type of issue of race or some type of confrontation that has black people on one side and white people on another side takes place. And then from that confrontation, there would be a destruction of a whole town, a destruction of a whole city where black people were at. One of the ones that has become more popular and more spoken about is what took place in Tulsa, which is also known as Black Wall Street, or Black Wall Street was a part of Tulsa. There's a movie entitled Rosewood, which as a child, the first time I ever seen these things or seen something like this happen was Rosewood. In Rosewood, it was a woman was cheating on her husband. Her husband found out she was cheating, and she said that she got raped by a black guy. And then all these white people went to the black town and just looted and destroyed in the town. And again, this happened. This happened very often. It would happen where a black person would move. It happens later on where black people move into neighborhoods that are considered segregated. They moved the first black people. What up? The first black people to move into neighborhoods that were segregated. A lot of them dealt with people rioting outside of their homes. It's this one story where a black family moved to a white neighborhood, and as they were in the white neighborhood, the post office, the mailman came by and was dropping mail off. And he goes into the mailbox of a family, and he realized that black people live in the house now, that it's a black family's mailbox. And so for the rest of his post route, for the rest of that day, he says, niggers have moved to whatever the name of his town is. It was, I don't know what the name of the town is. We say the town was Newark. So he just goes around for the whole day saying niggers have moved to Newark, niggers have moved to Newark, niggers have moved to Newark, for his whole route for the rest of the time. And then the next day, 1,000 people were outside of these black people's house, clamoring for them to leave, throwing bricks at their house, rioting outside of their house. The police were there. The police did not stop these things from happening. And so this is a regular occurrence of societal anger being taken out on black people in America and on people of color in America. It happened with indigenous tribes where white communities would go and would kill everybody in the area, kill everybody in the tribe, and then the story will be will be painted as some type of righteous expedition that took place. So I just want to read through this again and just read through what happened at the New York City draft riots. The New York City draft riots, among the most violent riots in American history, began as working class, predominantly Irish men rose up against the draft's incredible class bias. The law allowed a man of draft age to hire a substitute for $300, more than $6,000 in 2020 dollars, rather than serve, and as a result, few rich men wore the Union blue. But the riots turned into an anti-black pogrom, killing over 100 black people and burning down abolitionist homes, black bars and theaters, and even the colored orphan asylum. They burnt down the colored orphan asylum. In the aftermath of the riots, almost the entire black population fled the city, many of them settling in Brooklyn. Though they never reached such violent extremes elsewhere, in 1863, anti-war riots spread and racist anti-war sentiment ran rampant in the North. Think about that. So if you were in the South and you were trying to escape slavery, you were dealing with the racism that was intertwined with the slavery. You had to, even if you escaped to the North and got to the North, your life was in danger there because they were anti. All right, y'all, be safe, be safe, be safe. That's the opposite hand. It's the opposite hand. I see you fly too. That's a flying little outfit. Yeah, see, there you go. There you go. No, stop it. Don't lie to yourself. Don't lie to yourself. Y'all be safe. Where we at? I was making a point. I forgot the point. It don't matter. Okay, yeah, even if you went to the North and you got to the North, you had to still worry about the backlash, the white backlash. This has been something that has been documented and is spoken about regularly. But anytime that there has been anything perceived as black people taking a step forward, or black people collectively as a whole maybe furthering or progressing where they are at in the society, it has always been a backlash from the white community that has come along with it. People call Donald Trump being elected after Obama being in office for 8 years a form of white backlash. People called Nixon getting in office in '68 after some of the forward progression that was beginning to be made in the black community, a form of the white backlash. People called the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan after the end of Reconstruction and the resurgence of white vigilantism and the beginnings of or the deepenings of Jim Crow, a form of the white backlash of Reconstruction. And so even here now, they're speaking about this white backlash that came along for black people in the North because white people were mad that this war was happening, because white people were mad that that rich white people were buying their way out of the war. So let's continue. But class resentment of the war was even more pronounced in the South. As Armstead L. Robinson argues in his seminal Bitter Fruits of Bondage, the very fact that the war was being fought to preserve slavery doomed the Confederacy's cause from the outset. To show this, Robinson traces the social composition of the Confederacy, whose class makeup was oligarchic in the extreme. Out of the total population of the South, around 10 million people, 4 million were enslaved and 6 million were free. But of those free families, only 25% enslaved Africans, and of that 25%, only 10% had enough land and human property to qualify as, quote, planters, end quote. Yet, thanks to the Three-Fifths Compromise, that tiny cohort of planters had voting power equivalent to perhaps 2 million citizens in the North. A similar form of disenfranchisement continues in 2020, as imprisoned people are stripped of their right to vote, even though the census counts them as residents of the overwhelmingly rural, white counties where they are caged rather than the mostly black urban communities from which they are captured. Damn, that's crazy. Uh, Man, it ain't even no way for me to even put that more eloquently. That's crazy. As Robinson shows, when the Confederacy seceded, despite making peons to state, paeans? Okay. All right, I gotta look this up. I gotta look this one up. As Robinson shows, let me see something. Let's look this up. Dang. Okay. All right, this is the word. The word is spelled Paeans. I don't know. Definition. Pains. Let's see how it's enunciated. Peon. So like, okay, peon. A thing that expresses enthusiastic praise, a song of praise or triumph. Okay. As Robinson shows, when the Confederacy seceded, despite making peons to states' rights and individual sovereignty, the planter class doubled down on their oligarchic power, with planters and their allies taking almost every seat in the Confederate Congress and Cabinet. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was a plantation owner, as was Vice President Alexander Stephens and General Robert E. Lee. Though the vast majority of Confederate citizens were poor, backcountry yeomen, farmers with no human property, many living very far away, even from plantation country, they had no representation in the Confederate government. Let me try to read through that sentence again, my fault. Though the vast majority of Confederate citizens were poor, backcountry yeoman farmers with no human property, many living very far away, even from plantation country, they had no representation in the Confederate government. The planters' interest was the only interest truly represented in Richmond, the seat of the Confederate government, from May 29, 1861, just after the war began, until April 3, 1865, when it fell to Union forces. This meant that in secession after secession, the Confederate government passed draft exemptions for planters, overseers, and their families. Meanwhile, planters used their influence in local militias to keep corps of men at home for defense against fugitive and slave rebellion. At the very moment the Confederate cause needed all able-bodied men on the front lines, the planters schemed to increase the numbers of the slave patrols on the home front instead. The general strike of the enslaved made these patrollers' presence on each individual plantation even more necessary, as, at the same time, it made their efforts in aggregate totally fruitless. On plantations where work continued, slowdowns and disorder increased dramatically. Quote, morale, end quote, completely collapsed on many plantations, where the enslaved simply stopped working, fled en masse, or even took control themselves. Much was made in the Confederate press of the black sexual menace threatening the wives and daughters of planters left alone during wartime, a cruel and twisted propagandistic tool considering the centuries-long endemic rape of African women by their enslavers. However, the record shows remarkably little violence committed against planters or their families in the period. Du Bois explains this by suggesting it was simply easier to run away. And again, that is one of the most ironic hypocrisies of America when it comes to white and black relations, or when it comes to the caste system of black and white in America, is the amount of things that have been, the amount of ways in which stereotypes have been, hey, what's up, how you doing? Have a good day. the amount of ways in which stereotypes have been like reworked. There's this idea of black people as a whole in this nation being lazy and not wanting to work, and simultaneously, factually, the nation was built off the free work of black bodies and bodies of color. And then there's also this. There's anyone who knows the history of people who were enslaved, anyone who knows the history of the nature of the enslavement that went on in America knows the rampant rape of black women and black men. This was the thing, that black men also were raped. The rampant rape of Africans that took place by the people who would come to be known as the white caste system in America. And so and this was a thing that they turned around in the early 1900s, in the 1800s, for them to turn around this stereotype that black men were out here raping white women at astronomical rates, and that black men were animalistic and just wanted to rape white women. It's such a ironic hypocrisy, because it's the truth of the nation is such a 100-degree opposite at that time. And so, I just wanted to point out. But even as plantation production began to break down, and with it the economic backbone of the Confederacy, so too did soldier morale. Hardly the popular cause is white supremacist defenders today like to pretend. After an early burst of excitement in 1861, the Yeomen of the South began to see the Confederate struggle for what it was. Quote, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, end quote. Though this phase describes most of the wars ever fought in history, as Robinson shows, in the South this particular slogan was widespread and had devastating consequences. Entire Confederate companies melted away to desertion. In some places, dissident white yeomen assisted fugitives and spread intelligence about the war, serving as Union spies alongside enslaved people. In other regions, like the highlands of eastern Tennessee, poor white Unionists resisted the Confederacy with guerrilla warfare, opening up internal fronts that spread Confederate military forces thin. However, it is important not to confuse our current understanding of the Civil War with the motives of all who fought against the Confederacy. Although some of these yeomen were abolitionists, many of these Unionist forces were just as racist as their Confederate enemies. Nevertheless, they played a crucial role in bogging down the Confederacy and destroying its power. Thus, a war fought to preserve slavery produced the conditions under which the enslaved could escape and destroy it. In attempting to stop this social upheaval and preserve the slave system, Confederate policy exasperated class tensions, guaranteeing the Confederacy couldn't win the military struggle either. By the time black fugitives finally put on the Union blue, the war was as good as over for the Confederacy. As the Union ranks swelled with the 200,000 fugitives ready to take up arms against their former enslavers, the Confederate lines thinned, the plantations failed, and the planter class perished in a storm of fire and blood. And then, in this portion there, this horn shit is crazy. This horn been honking this whole damn live. In this portion here, you sort of see the way in which the classism within the racism became self-defeating, and you see the way in which, even though this racism was abound in the country, this racism was abound in the South and in the Confederate, most of the people who were racist didn't even have enough money to enact their racism in the form of having a bunch of chattel slaves. It was the again, the classism within the racism. But let's continue. I ain't gonna stunt the horn throw me off a little bit. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 arises as a crucial moment in the Union winning the war. The fact that the war was then being framed as a fight against slavery made it politically impossible for European capitalists to recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation and support it in combat. Just as importantly, it opened up the Union Army ranks to black soldiers and convinced black people that the Union was a cause worth fighting for. The Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to free the enslaved. It only declared slavery ended in the Confederacy, where the federal government had no actual power to enforce it, in effect only freeing those who had already freed themselves. Slavery was maintained in the border states of the Union, the states where Lincoln actually had the power to enforce emancipation. The proclamation affirmed and perhaps encouraged the general strike, but, as Lerone Bennett Jr. records, Secretary of State William H. Seward, who heaped scorn on the Emancipation Proclamation, told his friend Don Piatt that, quote, "We have let off a puff of wind over an accomplished fact," end quote. Quote, "What do you mean, Mr. Seward?" End quote. Piatt asked, quote, "I mean," end quote, he said, quote, "that the Emancipation Proclamation was uttered in the first gun fired at Fort Sumter, and we have been the last to hear it," end quote. Lincoln did not want to be an emancipator, but the enslaved understood what his war meant, and they surged forward to freedom anyway. Lincoln, that rarest of things, an intelligent politician, still spent nearly 2 years in denial before recognizing the enslaved were the key to Union victory and changing war policy to reflect it. But the enslaved moved his hand. Theirs was the glory of the Jubilee, theirs the defeat of the Confederacy, theirs the collapse of the planters and the building of Reconstruction. The general strike of the slaves was but one of the largest culminations in the long and continuing history of fugitive attacks on property and white supremacy in America. Indeed, quote, "Nowhere in history has so large a revolutionary seizure of property taken place," end quote. When the British abolished slavery in the West Indies in 1833, it remained legal in India, the Crown compensated all the enslavers for the value of their chattel, cash that constituted the seed money for many modern British corporations. But the Confederate planters received no such bailout. The value of human property in 1860 was $3 billion, which was equivalent to about 2/3 of the GDP. An equivalent percentage of the GDP today would be about $14 trillion. All of it abolished in the span of 4 years. Think about that. And again, this chapter is called Looting Emancipation. So think about that. The black body, the black body, the human property in 1860, $3 billion. They had $3 billion worth of human bodies, equivalent today to $14 trillion. To get free, and when you talk about, and just think about that when you talk about reparations. To get free, the enslaved had to steal themselves and, in so doing, abolish themselves as property. They had to loot themselves, entering a lawless relation to property and the state. The relationship between liberation and the stealing and destruction of property was never so obvious nor so clear-cut as it was during the period. An entire class of people, the planters, who had reigned aristocratic for 200 years, was suddenly destroyed, submerged entirely into the general population. When Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction in 1935, he was contesting a narrative by wealthy white Southerners and Ku Klux Klanners that they were the noble descendants of the slaveocracy. But as he made clear, appreciate it. You have a good day. Thank you. Stay safe. Of the names of prominent Southern families in Congress in 1860, only 2 appear in 1870, 5 in 1880. Of 90 prominent names in 1870, only 4 survived in 1880. Men talk today as though the upper class in the white South is descended from the slaveholders, yet we know by plain mathematics that the ancestors of most of the present Southerners never owned a slave nor had any real economic part in slavery. The disaster of war decimated the planters. The bitter disappointment and frustration led to a tremendous mortality after the war, and from 1870 on, the planter class merged their blood so completely with the rising poor whites that they disappeared as a separate aristocracy. The fugitives and the ex-slaves, impoverished, illiterate, faced their freedom in a war-torn country that resented their very existence and tried to make a good life for themselves. As Frederick Douglass remarked at the time, quote, "The work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins," end quote. They built schools, hospitals, and cooperatives, organized mutual aid societies and democratic ordinances, petitioned the federal government for land and autonomy, or simply took it for themselves. This is the period called Reconstruction. In the 1660s, they would have been able to make a... Oh, damn, I don't know how long that's been like that. It was a battery. I'm going to just start the paragraph. Okay. The fugitives and the ex-slaves, impoverished, illiterate, faced their freedom in a war-torn country that resented their very existence and tried to make a good life for themselves. As Frederick Douglass remarked at the time, quote, "The work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins," end quote. They built schools, hospitals, and cooperatives, organized mutual aid societies and democratic ordinances, petitioned the federal government for land and autonomy, or simply took it for themselves. This is the period called Reconstruction. In the 1660s, they would have been able to make a claim for freedom dues for their servitude. But in 1865, as in 2020, they and their descendants were scorned for demanding reparations. I just said. Yet they still tried to build a better world on the salted grounds of slavery. And even as the Southern planter class collapsed, ex-Confederates held on to their racial power through campaigns of vigilante terror, and Northern capitalists swooped in to win the spoils of war. The railroad men and the mine owners, the bankers, speculators and merchants, the senators, governors, and judges watched the planters drown and vowed not to let it happen to themselves. They ensured that their property could not be so easily looted. Neither would they ever allow its destruction to gain the moral righteousness and historical clarity of the struggle for emancipation. The revolution was begun, but not completed, and, as all partial revolutions, it would eventually sink back down under a morass of repression, violence, and confusion, waiting for a future generation to lift it up out of the muck, study its tactics, its promises, and its visions, and finally complete the dream of Jubilee. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 2, Looting Emancipation, and brings us to Chapter 3, entitled, All Cops Are Bastards, ACAB, which is a common saying around these parts. I want to... Man, that last portion right there, that last portion strikes with me real heavily. The revolution was begun, but not completed. And as all partial revolutions, it would eventually sink back down under a morass of I want to read back through the sentence and I'll butcher it. The revolution was begun, but not completed. And as all partial revolutions, it would eventually sink back down under a morass of repression, violence, and confusion, waiting for a future generation to lift it up out of the muck, study its tactics, its promises, and its visions, and finally complete the dream of Jubilee. And I believe that's what we're in the process of doing. We are pulling up a revolution that was not completed out of the ground, and studying the tactics, its promises, and its visions, and hoping for a completion. I think that, man, this was a real good chapter. It's been a great read so far. Again, the concept of, in these first two chapters, specifically in Chapter 2, heavily, of the black body being considered property. And so the freeing of themselves was the original looting, the first looting relationship that Africans had with this nation, that black people had with this nation. One of the things I spoke about was the first time I ever seen looting correlated with black people was during Hurricane Katrina, when white people would be painted as one way when they would be going and getting items for their survival and getting supplies for their survival, which they should have been doing. And then black people would be considered to be looting and painted in a different light. But I'm gonna end this chapter. I don't want to overtalk. I think that this chapter did a lot of speaking for itself. I mean, all the books do a lot of speaking for themselves, but we just want to go through the process of critically conversing about the things being brought up. So we're on the bottom. We're going to be on page 71 when we pick back up. I'm actually going to try to maybe pick back up and do a little bit more reading later on this evening. But for right now, we're going to wrap up chapter 3. We're going to end the wrapping up of chapter 2. Again, we are reading In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweil. I hope I'm pronouncing Vicky's last name correctly. And we're going to end this live the way that we try to end all the lives, and that's by saying rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Mark Bartmore, rest in power to Jovan Fresco, rest in power to Philip Johnson, rest in power to Jasper Banks, rest in power to Suzette Babler, rest in power to Shannon Graves, rest in power to Faustin Guaitigo, rest in power to Mikey Guzman, rest in power to Lil Mike Sago, rest in power to Joseph McCormick, rest in power to Eddie Patterson. We outside.